الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we are blessed by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His facilitation to have reached the beginning of the book of prayer. And our beloved Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam tells us, as-salatu khayru mawdu'. Prayer is the very best of matters. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made prayer of the most significant of matters. If you see how prayer is mentioned in the Quran, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that innani ana Allah, indeed I am Allah, la ilaha illa ana, there is no God but me, says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fa'abudni, so therefore worship me, so therefore serve me. وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِي, and establish prayer لِذِكْرِي, for my remembrance, in my remembrance. And this and numerous other verses show us that it is entailed by the reality of divine oneness that one worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's what befits Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so much so that the great Hanafi Imams, the Maturidis, actually deemed the underlying wisdom of prayer being that shukrul mun'im wajibun shar'an wa aqlan. Wajibun aqlan wa shar'an. The Maturidis would say that expressing gratitude for the bestower of blessings is entailed by reason and revelation. Of course, the specific kayfiyya, the specific modality is only known by Sharia, and the specific acts are only made obligatory by the Sharia. Of course, the Sad al-Ash'ari would say, while the intellect can discern benefits and harms, but it does not establish any act as being required such that it will be rewarded, or prohibited such that it will be punished, without there being sacred law. But with the presence of sacred law, this becomes, at some levels, more of a theoretical discussion, but it has implications as well, as can be found in its place. So the place of prayer is very central in the religion. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that prayer is the pillar of religion. It's a central support of the religion. He also tells us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-ahdu baynana wa baynahum as-salah. The covenant between us and them is the prayer. Right? The covenant between us and them is the prayer. فَمَنْ تَرَكَهَا, so whoever leaves it, فَقَدْ كَفَرْ, has committed an act of disbelief, meaning has committed an act only worthy of someone who doesn't believe. So what's understood from that faith entails that you turn to the one whom you claim to believe in. So the place of prayer and its role is very, very important. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, Ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah, seek assistance in patience and prayer. And al-musta'an bihi, what do you seek assistance for is not mentioned. meaning in anything, seek assistance in patience. Just remain firm on what is pleasing to Allah, and prayer. And in that light, the Prophet ﷺ is described that if any matter came up, the Prophet ﷺ would turn to prayer. Right? Would turn to prayer. And as we have mentioned, one should have a plan with respect to any chapter in any book that one approaches. So when it comes to prayer, we'll be looking at the legal rulings of prayer here. But it is very important to connect this study with, firstly, appreciation of the importance and virtues of prayer. And even if you've done it before, it's a good thing to always refresh and renew and build on what one has done before, either by reviewing what's done before, if one's done it, because that's the best of matters. Because you know it 60%, it's better to review it to get it up to 80%, 90%. Then do new things, so you know this kind of poorly and something else kind of poorly. So for this, in the level of the virtues of prayer and its merits, I would highly recommend looking at Riyadh al-Salihin by Imam Nawawi and the related chapters, and make a commitment to go through it, especially in the beginning of the book of prayer, on the general chapters related to the merits of prayer. If one's very familiar with Riyadh al-Salihin, then Imam al-Mundhiri's amazing work, At-Targhib wa Tarhib. Just be careful which editions you get, because there's some remarkably poor editions, some very pretty looking, but they're very poor. And some have very reductive hadith editing. And then the second component has to do with the inward dimensions of prayer. And there, whether it be looking at Imam Ghazali's Asrar al-Salah from the Ihya, which there's a very good summary in English called Inner Dimensions of Islamic Worship, but particularly the chapters on the inward dimensions. If you've studied Beginning of Guidance before, there's something to review. The chapters on the inner dimension, on the adab of prayer. The Book of Assistance of Imam al-Haddad. And there's many other works that, some of the great works of spirituality, like the Luma of Al-Sarraj or Kashf al-Mahjub, which actually translated into English. These have chapters on the inner dimensions of prayer as well. So that's an area that one cultivates on the adab of salah. Of course, there's a wonderful work taken from the Ihya by an author. He's said to be an Indian or from Central Asia. They're not sure about the author. There's some speculation. Called Aynul Ilm wa Zaynul Hilm, which is this author took the Ihya and tried to turn it into a matan. And Mulla Ali al-Qari has an amazing commentary on it, published in 2 volumes, called Sharh Ayn al-Ilm wa Zaynul Hilm. And there are many adab there, both in the section on purification and the section on prayer, that are very beneficial. Right? And he's also, of course, a great legal authority in the Hanafi school, Mulla Ali al-Qari. There's many points of benefit there. One of the most important practical aspects of the chapter on prayer from the fiqh perspective here is in Maraqi al-Falah, is Imam Ashrun Bulali has one of the most detailed breakdowns of the description of the prayer. It's what's called Bab Tarkib. Bab fi kayfiyati Tarkib Af'al al-Salah. Right? فصل في كيفية تركيب الصلاة, a chapter on the structure of the prayer. And that's something that practically, because we're not reading a novel, that, oh, don't tell me who did it, right? Like who killed Layla, right? Right? So that's one chapter you have to read ahead, because that has a direct implication on one's amal. And of course, the other aspect that's directly related to the amal, and I wouldn't wait till you get there, is a chapter on what one does after the prayer. And there's a very good section there in Imam Shurumbulali's Maraqi on the adhkar after the prayer, etc. That's a very rich component of this work, and he broke it down more than most fiqh books do. And that, of course, the final thing that don't neglect, and you can connect it to your reading of the section on the description of the prayer in the Maraqi, is to look at Kitab al-Adhkar of Imam al-Nawawi and the prophetic adhkar related to the prayer, right? Because we want to study the book of prayer, but we want to improve our prayer, right? Like we want to understand the fiqh of it, but we want to improve our prayer, right? So these are, and it's going to take us some time to go through the book of prayer because this is very detailed, but we should have a focus on what is there's a natija amaliya, there's a practical, there's a practical aspect of benefiting from the chapter, which we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate for us and you, because the believer sees things as mirrors, right? Existence is a mirror because it reflects the light of its creator. له الكون مرآة ومظهر الصفات. له الكون مرآة ومظهر الصفات, right? As Shaykh Ahmad al-Alawi has said. But the believer looks at things as a mirror for themselves as well. The believer, al-mu'minu mir'atul mu'min, the believer is a mirror for the believer, right? So, but likewise, knowledge is a mirror that we look at ourselves in it, and we recognize that where we fall short, so that we try to rectify, right? So that's an aspect as well. One of the great ways of enriching our prayers is to bring and keep renewing the prophetic adhkar that are within it in one's opening of the prayer. Many Hanafis imagine there's only one dua one can do in the beginning. That's an emphasized sunnah, but particularly in the non-obligatory prayers, there's no naskh of the other du'as of opening the prayer. And there are multiple hadiths that indicate that the Prophet ﷺ did several of them, and as the larger works in the fiqh of worship mention, and we'll see it when we come to it in the Maraqi. Likewise in the ruku', in the standing up from the ruku', in the prostration, between the two prostrations, where actually the dua between the two prostrations, which is not intrinsically recommended in the Hanafi school, but some of the Hanbali said it's wajib. So Imam Ibn Abdin inclines to its being recommended, either intrinsically in our madhab, which is not the predominant opinion, or at least to be careful to do it, to avoid the difference of opinion of those who held the prayer to be deficient without it. And so on. So these are some of the aspects. One of the greatest summaries of the realities of prayer is given in the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah al-Secondary, rahimahullah ta'ala, both of the reality of prayer and the wisdoms of how it was legislated. And one of the commentaries on the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah that's very useful to have, because it's one of the more accessible ones, is the Sharh of Imam al-Sharnubi. It's edited by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Bizm, who edited also Sharh al-Sawi on the Jawhara. And one of the useful things about it, besides the clarity of the commentary, is that the editor, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, appended at the end of the book the Fahras al-Mawdu'i, al-Muttaqi al-Hindi, did an indexing of the hikam. It's very useful. For any topic, you can see which are the hikam that are on that topic. And so that's a very useful thing. Right. And Ibn Ata'illah says, "As-salatu matharatun lil-qalb min adnas al-dhunub wa istiftahun li-abwab al-ghuyub." That prayer is a purification from the vileness of one's sins. As-salatu matharatun lil-qulub min adnas al-dhunub. Prayer is a purification of hearts from the vileness of sins or contraventions, because that the contraventions are one's acts of wrongdoing, one's acts of sin, but also one's shortcomings, one's heedlessness, all of those. Right? There are degrees of dhanb, right? Of contraventions. Wastiftah, and a seeking of opening of the doors of the unseen, of the doors of presence. To go from the alam al-hiss ila alam al-ma'na, to the world of just of the tangible to the world of the intangible. Because there's a work in Hanafi fiqh, but it has a very useful chapter at the end on spirituality. It's called Al-Jawahir by Al-Khawarizmi. It's recently published by Dr. Ayman al-Jamal, who edited it. That what is the spiritual path? The spiritual path is built upon casting aside the delusion of this illusory world, and so that one puts consciousness of Allah first, and that is the heart of the prayer is presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then there's a wonderful treatise by one of the great imams of the Sayyid al-Ba'alawi, called Sifatu Salat al-Muqarrabin by Habib Hassan al-Bahr al-Jifri. And it was edited and published on its own by Shaykh Hassanain Makhlouf, the distinguished Maliki scholar and a very senior scholar at Al-Azhar, but also published as part of the complete works and perhaps in a better, nicer edition, certainly. And that's an amazing work on the inward dimensions of prayer. And there's a complete recording of that is explanatory of it by Habib Hussein al-Saqaf, and another complete teaching of Sifat Salat al-Muqarrabin by Habib Muhammad Abdul Rahman al-Saqaf. Both do a wonderful job of unpacking its meanings, and highly recommended. There's also 6 lessons, very, very brief but very rich, of Habib Umar bin Hafiz, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala. But there's 6 lessons, but he doesn't explain all of it. They're private majalis, but they're put up. They're on his website. We could share. So if we could share these resources, we could put it on the message board, or put them together. Some of these recommended resources, we could, make sure we've got sound editions of it. So these are all things that one can be plugging away, because improving one's prayer is an active effort, right? Iqamatu salah, right? This is an active effort. Aqama al-shay, you direct this establishing prayer, but aqama yuqimu, iqamatan, right, is you direct this meaning towards something else, right? So there is your prayer, and there's you, and there's a standard for the prayer, which is sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, pray as you have seen me pray. And we're trying to approximate the prophetic prayer, right? But we fall short, right? But that's the but what Allah has not commanded us to pray, right? Allah has commanded us to establish the prayer, right? To iqamatu shay, itmamuhu wa ikmaluhu wa ikhraju i'wijajihi wa naqsihi wa ib'aduhu يعني من سمات الغفلة والتقصير, right? So, the iqamah of something is to strive to perfect, to complete it and perfect it, and to remove from it the characteristics of shortcomings and deficiency and heedlessness. So as Ibn Ata'illah says in his many aphorisms related to prayer, إِذْ لَيْسَ كُلُّ مُصَلٍّ مُقِيمٍ, because not everybody who prays establishes the prayer. So let's look at what the author has to say. قال الإمام فقيه النفس حسن بن عمار الشرنبلالي الوفائي رحمة الله تعالى عليه كتاب الصلاة. They tell us, Imam Tahtawi tells us that in his لم يخلو عنها الشريعة مرسل, no sacred law of a previous messenger was bereft of prayer. وما اختص به نبينا صلى الله عليه وسلم بمجموع الصلوات الخمس. What is unique to our beloved messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم is having the 5 prayers and the specifics, certain specifics of the prayer. Which specifics are unique to us? We don't know for sure, because the previous revelations have not been preserved. So we can't say for sure, right? So the prayer, and we see that in the mention in the Quran of previous prophets mentioning their prayer and being commanded to pray, etc., that they prayed. And we see traces of the fact that they prostrated, and that they fell prostrate, etc. But what was the kayfiyah of their prayer? We don't know specifically, right? And we will see some of the other discussions related to it in what Imam Shurunbulali has to say. So he has a lengthy introduction in his commentary. So he says, لا بد قال رحمه الله لا بد من بيان معناها لغة وشريعة ووقت افتراضها وعدد أوقاتها وبيانها وركعاتها وحكمة افتراضها وسببها وشروطها وحكمها وركنها وصفتها. So it's necessary to explain the meaning of the term prayer, salah, in the language and in divine guidance, sharia, and when it was legislated, and the number of its times, and the detail of the prayer, and the number and the details of the timings, and the number of rak'ahs, and the wisdom of its obligation, and the legal cause behind it, and its conditions, and in its rulings, and its integrals, and its description. So he breaks down here. This is ijmal qabla tafsil. So he mentions in brief, these are muqaddimat. These are introductory investigations related to the chapter. So he says, فهي في اللغة عبارة عن الدعاء. So in the Arabic language, the word salah has the meaning of dua, right? And as Tahtawi mentions, that is the haqiqi meaning of the term, and other meanings are majaz, are metaphorical. Right? That's what's mentioned by al-Jawhari, the author of the Sahah. And that's what the usage was. The Arabs used the term salah لِمُطْلَقِ الدُّعَاء, for dua. And that's of course the shared meaning between us performing prayer and salah ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and prayer upon the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? It's salah on the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam is dua. But dua, of course, so one of the things, طالب العلم هو طالب معان, right? Right? So what is dua? Right? What is dua? Right? And here, it's good to connect these things. Dua is an expression of neediness, right? Dua is an expression of neediness, and we direct our neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because only He can fulfill it, right? Which is the relationship between dua and rahmah, right? Dua and talab al-rahmah, right? Because you realize your neediness to Allah, so you ask Him, right? So this is something to be reflecting upon, that what is the meaning then of dua, right? That dua is not just talab, right? Dua is talab, right? But it's, right, as one of the definition of dua is إظهار الافتقار بين يدي العزيز الجبار or عزيز القهار. It's to affirm your complete neediness before the majestic and all-powerful, right? Ad-du'a says Imam Zarruq explained it as being طلب مصحوب بآداب في بساط العبودية لجانب الربوبية. Right? What is dua? Because that's the essence of prayer, right? And dua, so what is prayer? Prayer is a particular type of dua. It's an all-body dua, right? But dua, what is it? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Ad-du'a mukhul ibadah." Dua is the essence of worship, right? So prayer is the essential worship, because dua, your prayer is dua, and dua is mukhul ibadah, is the essence of worship, or ad-du'a huwa al-ibadah. Dua is worship. Both established narrations. So ad-du'a talabun mashubun bi-adabin في بساط العبودية لجانب الربوبية. Dua is a seeking accompanied by proper manners on the spread of slavehood, directed towards the presence of lordship. Right? Right? And the ulama have a lot to say about the reality of dua. The editor of this compilation called Al-Ta'rifat al-Zarruqiyya, he says that the great Maliki Imam al-Qarafi said, "Ad-du'a talabun li fadlillahi ta'ala." Dua is a seeking of bounty from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, min ghayri wujubi sabab al-istihqaq, without there being any cause for deserving it. Right? Because that's a, right? 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 And in his 17th commentary on the Hikam, he says, "Ad-du'a ubudiyatun سرها إظهار الفاقة. Dua is ubudiyya. Dua is slavehood. You're not actually asking, because the servant recognizes all kinds of needs, but I only need you. Right? They're just expression of my need. Right? الدعاء عبودية. Dua is slavehood. That's all it is. Sirruha, its secret is إظهار الفاقة, is expressing, not by pretense, but existentially, one's faqa, right? One's complete indigence, right? One's complete and utter need, right? So this is, much can be said about that, but it's important not, so okay, prayer is dua, okay, but then the question is, do you know what dua is? So yeah, dua, hold on, right? Are you speaking from your understanding, or are you speaking from what the imams of this deen have said, right? And the seeking the prophetic inheritance is to go beyond just scattered knowledge, or scattered is, part of the wiratha is that one's understanding, one's consciousness, but also, one's conduct and state should be connected to this inheritance that's come through the imams of the deen, right? Okay, that's why the usage of the word salah in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ with the meaning of dua is frequent, though not the primary usage. For example, in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 103, as Imam Tahtawi mentions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ, and pray over them. أي أدعو لهم, pray for them, right? Make dua for them. صَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ. And in the hadith, with respect to answering someone's invitation, right? And the hadith in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَإِنْ كَانَ صَائِمًا فَلْيُصَلِّ. And if you're fasting, then it's not, then go pray, but rather, then make dua for the host, right? Right? Because properly, if one is invited and one is fasting, one should still answer the invitation and be discreet, and the hosts should, be respectful, but there shouldn't be takalluf on either side. And at the end, to express one's gratitude and appreciation, one makes extra dua for the host, right? Okay, so that's the lexical meaning of dua, right? It's of salah, it's a dua, and the connection between prayer and dua. You are turning to Allah in expression of need. And وفي الشريعة عبارة عن الأركان والأفعال المخصوصة. Prayer is very difficult to define legally. Why? Because if you say it's comprised of these actions, then many of them can be missed. Even the integrals. You don't always have to stand. And if you don't stand, you're not really bowing. There's such circumstances where we may not be doing a full prostration. Right? So if you think about it, so what part of it is required? Because some things are غير قابل للسقوط, some are قابل للسقوط. The follower doesn't recite the Quran, the Imam does. So all these different things, so they define it, which tells you that it's tricky to define. In the Sharia, Salah is specific integrals and actions, right? And some have tried to come up with a more nuanced definition, but it's very, very difficult to do, right? So that's why even others have struggled to really hit a formal definition for it. So then he says, وَفُرِضَتْ لَيْلَةَ الْمِعْرَاجِ. It became obligatory on the night of the Mi'raj. What became obligatory on the night of the Mi'raj? The 5 obligatory prayers. فُرِضَتْ الْخَمْس, right? The 5 prayers, right? Right? Before that, the wajib was 2 rak'ahs. كانت الصلاة مثنى. Right? The prayer used to be 2 rak'ahs, right? And the initial legislation of prayer and purification was almost immediately after revelation. Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam showed the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam the wudu and the prayer. And it's the very first hadith in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. You can see that. And also, of course, the very first hadith in the Muwatta of Imam Malik shows also, very interestingly, the issue about the Asr time according to Imam Abu Hanifa. And you can find that if you look for it. So what was obligatory on the night of the 20th of the Mi'raj, of the ascent to heaven, was the 5 prayers. Right? وعدد أوقاتها 5 للحديث. And the number of times of the prayer are 5 due to the hadith, right? And there's number of hadith, amongst them a hadith that is a fundamental hadith with respect to prayer, which is the hadith of Ta'lim al-A'rabi, of the Prophet ﷺ teaching the A'rabi the prayer, right? And also the hadith on the imamah of Jibreel alayhi salam, which you can also find. It's in the Muwatta of Imam Malik and in multiple other places. And more importantly than that, right? الأوقات خمس بالقرآن, right? بالقرآن, right? And each of the prayer times are affirmed in the Quran. Each of the 5 prayer times are affirmed clearly in the Quran, right? And that's also very important because that's the dalil al-qat'i, but also multiple hadiths. And then, of course, there's the comprehensive reality, which is ijma'. There's the ijma'. There's things that they're not up for discussion. Someone does a rereading. Ijma' is like the hima of the deen, right? Is the preserved grounds of the deen. Like, you cannot go outside of that, right? And that's part of the preservation of the deen, right? And the ijma' is what there's agreement on, but there's also ijma', consensus, can define, and there's parameters for this, what enters within da'irat al-khilaf, what enters within acceptable difference, right? Like the status of witr, for example, right? The Hanafi says it has a janib of fardiyya, of being fard amali. But that's within there's an ijma' around it that you cannot go outside of this. Someone says there's only 4 obligatory prayers. You're way out in the woods somewhere, right? Someone says more or less, that ijma' is very, very important. Okay, bismillah. وَالْوِتْرُ وَاجِبٌ لَيْسَ مِنْهَا. And so here there's an implicit question. Well, so what about the witr? So that the witr is, in its roots in our madhab, wajib, right? Not fard qat'i, and it's not of the obligatory prayers in that sense. وَفُرِضَتْ الصَّلَاةُ فِي الْأَصْلِ رَكْعَتَيْن. The prayer was initially obligatory as 2 rak'ahs, إلا المغرب, except for Maghrib. فأقرت في السفر وزيدت في الحضر إلا في الفجر. Right? And so the prayer was initially legislated as 2 rak'ahs for all prayers except for Maghrib, and then it remained that way for the traveler and was increased in, for the one who was resident, except for the Fajr prayer, which remained as 2 rak'ahs. وحكمة افتراضها شكر المنعم. The wisdom of its legislation is gratitude to the bestower of blessings. Right? And number of other wisdoms that the ulama have detailed. Amongst them, what Imam Tahtawi mentioned, takfiru dhunub, right? The expiation of sins, right? You can see the related hadiths, and there's many wisdoms that are affirmed in the Quran, right? Inna salata tanha anil fahsha'i wal munkar. Prayer prevents from vice and wrong. And prayer as being a means of expiation, of reward, of drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But these ultimately, shukrul mun'im. Right? That's the wisdom of its being obligatory. وسببها الأصلي. So now, there's 2 kinds of asbab, 2 kinds of causes related to the prayer. The original cause for the obligation of prayer, of any given prayer, is the divine address. But how do you respond to the divine address? The outward means, which is dukhulul waqt, is our means of knowing the tawjih of the khitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us. Right? So sababuha al-asli, its original cause, is khitabullahi ta'ala al-azali, is the eternal divine address. Right? وَالْأَوْقَاتُ أَسْبَابٌ ظَاهِرًا. And the times of the prayer are outward causes as a facilitation for us. Okay? And there's some discussion here in Tahtawi that you can see that distinguishes different types of. There's sabab wujub and sabab ada, etc. Tahtawi explains it. We don't need to get into it over here. وَشُرُوطُهَا سَتَعْلَمُهَا. The conditions of prayer, you'll see them. With respect to the conditions of prayer, it's important to keep in mind, however, that Imam, both with the conditions and integrals, Imam Ash-Shurunbulali in Nur al-Idah itself and in the Maraqi does jama', he gathers. And the gathering is encompassing and can be overwhelming. So it's good to keep the core skeletal structure of what are the conditions of prayer and the obligatory acts of prayer, the integrals of prayer in one's mind. How many shurut are there of the salah? 7. And how many integrals? 5. Right? Right? That's the core. That should be clear. So that this huge, detailed shower that comes, it fits in those parts. Right? In the 7 conditions and the 5. Likewise, the wajibat. Right? If you look in Maraqi Sa'adat, for example, they're listed as 11 or 12 wajibs. Right? Then you see this huge number that's in the Maraqi. Don't let it stress you. They all go back. They're around these. And it can help to sort of do a synthetic diagramming of the shurut, arkan, and wajibat of the salah, and then of the whole prayer. They're core sunnahs of prayer. That's why the short texts are quite useful. A short but well-structured text, like ascent to felicity, whatever, gives the core sunnahs, right? And then, so you can diagram those, and then all these details come on top of it, and that helps retain those details as well. So keep that in mind. Okay. وحكمها, right? حكم الشيء هو الأثر المترتب عليه. What is the ruling of prayer? سقوط الواجب ونيل الثواب. Right? Right? حكمها, what is the ruling? Ruling here meaning the implication of the prayer, the consequence of the prayer is that the wajib is lifted from you, right? In this life. Your dhimma is considered cleared, right? Right? The dhimma is a wi'a'un i'tibari تدخل فيه الحقوق ولا تخرج إلا بأداء أو قضاء أو بأداء أو قضاء أو عفو. If the one who has the haqq, overlooks it for you, right? ونيل الثواب في الآخرة, right? يعني بشرط إن كان مخلصا, right? This is بشرط الإخلاص, if sincere, right? And then there's an extensive discussion that's scattered in many books about what is the relationship between sincerity and prayer. What if someone prayed, and in that you can look at sincerity at 3 levels. You have you have sincerity, you have deficient sincerity, and you have no sincerity. Right? And then the prayer is either fard or nafil. And then the levels of sincerity, complete, proper sincerity, deficient, or none, could be during the prayer, when you began the prayer, because that's when the action, the critical intention is at the beginning of the action. That's the legally critical. Or what if the insincerity comes during the prayer? And then you can also, the fuqaha also looked at sincerity and insincerity, if it had to do with the nafs salah. So Uncle Jamil sitting there, so the only reason you're praying is Uncle Jamil, or it's in awsaf as-salah, so you pray better. This is majestically summarized, and it's because it's discussed in many places. Ibn Abdin summarizes. It's majestically summarized in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah, and also discussed based on what's in Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah plus here by al-Nahlawi. Right? And that's where the old edition of the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah, the Shaykh al-Burhani edition, is very useful because it has an index of masail. So the mabhath of ikhlas, this is of course the legal dimensions of ikhlas. It's very, very useful. Right? It's very, very useful. I mean, it's critical, it's existentially critical. Bismillah. So, وصفتها, and the description of the prayer, إما فرض أو واجب أو سنة ستعلمها مفصلة إن شاء الله تعالى. The prayer can be obligatory or necessary or sunnah, as you will know, inshallah ta'ala. So this is the introduction. Then he says, ويشترط لفرضيتها ثلاثة أشياء. So there's شروط الافtirad and there's شروط الصحة, right? Right? And he did this with tahara as well. There's conditions for obligations and there's conditions for validity. So يشترط لفرضيتها, it's a condition for the prayer to be obligatory, أي لتكليف الشخص بها, for a person to be morally responsible for it. right? ثلاثة أشياء, three things. الإسلام لأنه شرط للخطاب بفروع الشريعة. The first is Islam because Islam is a condition to be addressed with the details of the Sharia. Right? And this is a lengthy discussion in usul al-fiqh, right? That will someone who rejects belief be punished both for their rejection and they're not acting on guidance, right? And there's both possibilities. And we talked about it earlier, and Imam Tahtawi pointed to the earlier discussion. That's the first. وَالْبُلُوغ إِذْ لَا خِطَابَ عَلَى الصَّغِيرِ. And the second is bulugh. It's, having reached puberty, because there's no moral accountability before that. ولكن تؤمر بها الأولاد إذا وصلوا في السن ل7 سنين وتضرب عليها ل10 بيد لا بخشبة. Right? However, children are commanded to pray when they reach the age of 7. Right? This is أمر استحباب. Right? استحبابا. Right? وتضرب عليها ل10 بيد, and they can be disciplined regarding it with hand, not with a stick. A عصا كجريدة, not with a stick or like a palm frond kind of thing. رفقا به, out of gentleness with the child. وزجرا, and warning them حسب طاقته, in a manner that they can bear. ولا يزيد على 3 ضربات بيده, and one cannot go beyond 3 strikes with the hand. Now, المأمور به, right, هو التأديب. Right, this is هذا ضرب تأديب. Right, right, لا تعذيب. Right, right, ولا توجيع. Right, this is the purpose of this is ta'deeb, is to instill, is to discipline the child. It's to instill discipline, and it's not an act of worship. Like, okay, 1 strike, 10 rewards, 2, 20, 30, 40. Right? Rather, al-maqsood huwa at-ta'deeb. Right? What's sought is instilling discipline, such that they would act on it themselves, right? Because done out of rifqan bihi, out of care and gentle concern for the child and awareness of their capacity. And context and circumstance would depend. And the Prophet ﷺ's own example was he never struck any spouse, nor child, nor servant, nor even an animal, alayhi salatu wasalam. Right? So these are descriptive, not prescriptive, right? It's not an encouragement here to hit your children, right? And there's an iqtida'un nas, there's something that is necessarily implicit in the text, which is, and discipline them regarding them, walau bid-darb, even if it were to be with hitting them. There's a very good discussion here in many places, but you can see it very nicely in the hadiths, on the rights of others, in Ibn Allan's commentary on Riyadh al-Salihin. And this is based on legal discussion by Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, where he looks at those situations where the Shara allowed hitting. If you step back and see, okay, what is the legal bases of rulings in Islam, right? Rulings have a purpose, which is dar'u al-mafasid wa jalbu al-masalih, right? Prevention of harm and attainment of benefit, right? What is the harm that we're seeking to avert? Hmm? Yeah, so there is an immediate harm, which is the laxity towards prayer. But prayer itself, what is it? Yeah, it's a sabab for what? Of taqarrub and taqwiyat al-iman, right? Right? So prayer, because there's levels of maqasid, right? So we want to prevent laziness with respect to the prayer. We want to prevent missing the prayer because of its obligation. And we want to prevent, beyond that, the higher maqsid, which is, we want to prevent weakness of faith. We want to preserve deen, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing, Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam points out, and Ibn Allan quotes it, many others do as well, right? With respect to hitting, but this sort of applying it over here, is that what is the basis of, you have to understand what is the basis of a relationship between two parties. Okay? Nobody has rights over another unless granted by the Sharia. So what is the nature of the responsibility of the parent and child? The parent's responsibility is to safeguard the interests of the child. And again, the same maratib of wilaya and mas'uliyah, that the parent's child is not to be policemen. Don't, right? The immediate thing is, you don't want them to be lazy about prayer. But more important than that is you want them to actually pray. More important than that is you want to take care of their iman. And which is part of the hifz of their deen, right? So how it is approached needs to keep these things in mind. That it's not just, okay, they didn't pray, how does that affect their ada as-salah? Right? And the idea of ta'deeb is the instilling of adab. Right? Ta'deeb, addaba, is to instill adab, which is to instill the capacity and the concern within the other party to act, to have the attitude, action and response that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to any circumstance. So ta'deeb is not punitive, right? Ta'deeb is to instill, ta'deeb huwa gharsul adab. And the adab is al-ihtimam بالمستحسن الذي يظهر بكيفية النظر إلى الأشياء وكيفية العمل وفق مرضاة الله تعالى. Right? So that needs to be kept in mind, right? And there's a lot of ta'addi with respect to this, with parents. And parenting is not easy. But the purpose is to ghars of that ihtimam. Now, then hitting another, you don't have is a mafsada. By the standard of the Sharia, hitting another is a mafsada. Because you don't have a right to hit anybody. Right? So, when it is established, khilaful asl. It's established khilaful asl. And the basis of relations is rahmah. Right? Is rahmah. And it's lean. And rifq is mercy and gentleness. So when if they were hitting, it would be in line with these values. That this would be محققا لمصلحة هذا الشخص الدينية, that would fulfill the best interest of the child, and it would be considered a lesser harm, and that attains these benefits but does not result in greater harms. Right? So it's khilaful asl. It's khilaful asl. But there is, in numerous Muslim societies, way beyond anything that is any way permissible, right? So which is why يبالغ في تحذير الناس عنه. People are to be firmly warned about it, because people go way beyond anything that is permitted. One, just in terms of the limit of the law with respect to it. Number two, the maqsood al-shara minhu. But rather, there are clear mafasid shar'iyya in it. Right? بيده قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مروا أولادكم بالصلاة لسبع واضربوهم عليها لعشر. Said, command your children to pray when they reach the age of 7, and discipline them regarding it when they reach the age of 10, and separate them in their bedding. Right? And the separating them in their bedding, right? This is if they are under the same sheet and there's no clothing and separate between them, right? If they're uncovered, then you separate between any two adults, unless they're married, under the same sheet. Right? If they are clothed, then if they're of the same gender, then it's better for them to be under a separate sheet, but not a requirement. But if one or both reach adulthood, then they should not be under the same sheet, even if clothed, right? Right? And this is, right? And caution is needed in these things. Right? أما النوم بالمجاورة مع ستر كل عورته بساتر يخصه ولو كان الغطاء واحدا فلا مانع ويحرر. But as for both sleeping covered, each with their own covering, even if they be under one bed sheet, this is not prohibited, but it's still mahallu ihtiyat, but it's still a place of caution. Right? And you can see further details in Nahlawi's Al-Hadr al-Ibaha. Okay, so we'll pause here for Maghrib at the asbabuha awqatuha, and then we will continue bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Yes. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So we reached وَأَسْبَابُهَا, and the cause for the prayer, right? And إِنِ أَوْقَاتُهَا, right, are the times of prayer. Now, there's a technical discussion on this that is discussed nicely in Tahtawi. You can read the discussion in Tahtawi. That's what's the cause of the prayer, right? Right? And in general, right, there's a broad cause, which is, is the time, right? And when the time enters, then it becomes generally obligatory. So that's a general cause. But the effective cause of the prayer is الجزء الذي اتصل به الأداء, is the moment in which you began praying. That was your effective cause of the prayer. Right? So generally, if the time of the prayer enters, now هذا الوقت صالح لأداء الصلاة, right? But the moment where you entered the prayer, think about when exactly do you enter the prayer. That is the جزء الذي اتصل, that's the effective cause. But then this is إذا كان الوقت باقيا. This is if the time is still in. Because once the time enters, any moment within the prayer time is salih, is fit to initiate the prayer in. But then when the prayer time goes out, which part of the prayer time is the sabab for the ada, for the qada? فالقضاء يضاف إلى جملة الوقت. Right? When you're making up the prayer, right? Now, you're not making it up, you're fulfilling the command outside its time. So you cannot ascribe it to any individual moment within the time, so it's ascribed to the entirety of the time. And that's why we will see that the prohibited times you cannot make up a prayer in. Why? Because the prayer time as a whole was kamil, was complete. Right? So you cannot لا يؤدى الكامل بالناقص. You cannot fulfill something complete with something that is deficient. Right? Which is doing it in a prohibited time, making it up in a prohibited time. Within the time, so for example, you pray with 5 minutes left for Maghrib, that is still جزء صالح للأداء من الوقت, right? الذي هو السبب العام, right? Within the time, every moment within the time, even the prohibitively disliked time, is a moment that is fit to fulfill the obligation. So there, the obligation is fulfilled, but in the prohibitively disliked time, you incur the sin of that delay. And you can read what Tahtawi has to say there about it, this simplified description of it. Okay. وتجب أن يفترض فعلها بأول الوقت وجوبا موسعا. The prayer becomes obligatory to perform from the beginning of the time with it an expansive obligation. Right? فلا حرج حتى يضيق عن الأداء. And there's no harm, i.e. no sin in delay, right, from the first of the time, until and unless one reaches a time where there is not sufficient time to make ada, such that one begins and ends the prayer within the time. ويتوجه الخطاب حتما. Then when there's not sufficient time to complete the prayer, or you're getting close to that, it becomes more and more emphatic. Right? ويأثم بالتأخير عنه. And then delaying it beyond the moment when you could begin and end the prayer within the time, you are now sinful. So you're obligated to pray, but you are sinful for that delay, even in other than Fajr. Right? والأوقات للصلوات المفروضة خمسة. That the times for the obligatory prayers are 5. أولها وقت صلاة الصبح is a time for the dawn prayer. Right? الوقت, and he defines what is time. مقدار من الزمن المفروض لأمر ما. It's a portion of time that is delineated for whatever matter. Right? Of course, this is a practical definition given for the purposes of the fuqaha. Time, what is the reality of time? This is one of the discussions of the mutakallimin and the falasifa. Right? And it's not that's not the concern here, but beware of mixing terminology. Okay. من ابتداء طلوع الفجر, from the beginning of the entering of Fajr time, right? لإمامة جبريل عليه السلام, من إمامة سيدنا جبريل عليه السلام حين طلع الفجر, because Jibril prayed at that time, as-Sadiq, the true first dawn. Here Imam Tahtawi points something out. You can also see discussion on this in Imam Ibn Abidin's Radd al-Muhtar, that there are 2 opinions actually within the Hanafi school with respect to the entering of Fajr times. One is من ابتداء, one is من أول طلوع الفجر الصادق, when the first appearance of horizontal light, right? Right? And this is the position of some of them. Right? And then Tahtawi mentioned, وقال بعضهم, and other scholars said, العبرة لاستطارته في الأفق, is when that first light on the horizon now spreads. And he says, وهذا القول أبين وأوسع. This opinion is more evident and more expansive. والأول أحوط, and the first is more precautionary. Right? And some mention that there's about 3 degrees of difference between the 2 opinions. So the first, and of course there's a work on this issue by Dr. Asim Yusuf, Hafidhahullah. What's it called?
Shedding light on the dawn.
Yeah, shedding light on the dawn. And there's many tricky components. Any place where there's artificial human light, seeing the dawn exactly is a challenge, right? A lot of calendars are based on just conjecture. Simple calculation depends what are you trying to calculate, right? And you go to the doctor and say, am I okay? Well, it doesn't matter. Like, what do you define as okay, right? Like, are you alive? Yeah. Living, breathing. But are you saying, are you healthy like an athlete is healthy? La. Right? Am I going to, it would appear I'm healthy enough to remain alive for the next year or 2 because I'm getting married? So someone asks. So, that's why you have to know. So, well, we go by calculations. What calculations and what are you calculating, right? So they require dabt. Practically, in the absence of knowing better, one can, that common person, they just ask, what's a reliable local timetable? And you follow it, right? But it's part of the responsibility for the Ahl al-Ilm for any region, from their Fard Kifaya. And for religious institutions, as institutions, to collectively take the means of having sound systems for establishing the prayer times. Right? And there's and also these are matters where there should be a broader effort, and these broader efforts take time, for there to be a consistency in setting the times. Right? Because it's a mafsada to have all kinds of people having all kinds of calculations for Fajr and etc. But that would explain the multiple, because possibilities that arise. Now, practically, with respect to time and so on, if you a believer is someone who is principled. So if you follow a system, then stick with it, right? So if you follow the 18-degree calculation, let's say, or the 15-degree calculation, whichever, then you can stick to it. So you wake up before that, you can do your tahajjud. If you wake up after that, then you do your fajr, right? Say, oh, today I'll take the 15, I'll do my tahajjud, then do this. No, don't. That's tala'ub. It's better to feel bad, and then you do tahajjud afterwards. But it's important to be consistent, right? And of course we'll see it's makruh to delay Isha beyond its, into the last half of the night. But let's say someone they woke up, if they follow the 18-degree time, or whichever time, and they woke up beyond it, then one acts that, okay, I have missed my Isha prayer. So one makes tawbah and repents, and one does qada for it, right? One hastens. One could hope that, okay, if it's still within the other time, but don't just have moving boundaries, because then that leads to takasul in this and in other matters. That's what the Mashayikh mentioned. Okay. الصادق هو الذي يطلع يعني عرضا منتشرا, right? The true dawn is the one that appears on the horizon horizontally and spreads. والكاذب, the false dawn, يظهر طولا ثم يغيب. It appears vertically and then disappears. وقد أجمعت الأمة على أن أوله الصبح الصادق. The Ummah is in consensus that the beginning of Fajr time is the true dawn, with the difference of opinion that we mentioned before, right? Right? إلى قبيل طلوع الشمس, till just before the rising of the sun, which is when any part of the orb of the sun appears on the horizon, right? So, but the matan here itself clarifies what is meant by ila tulu' al-shams, because some other mutun just mention ila tulu' al-shams, right, till sunrise. But by sunrise it can mean when any part of the sun appears on the horizon, or the whole sun appears on the horizon, right? And right? Right? لقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام وقت صلاة الفجر ما لم يطلع قرن الشمس الأول. The time of Fajr prayer remains until no part of until the first part of the sun has not risen, right? The qarn is the tip, right? وثانيها وقت صلاة الظهر من زوال الشمس عن بطن السماء بالاتفاق. The second time is the time of Dhuhr, which is from when the sun goes beyond the middle of the sky by agreement, right? ويمتد إلى وقت العصر, and it lasts to Asr time, right? وفيه روايتان عن الإمام, and there are two narrations from Imam Abu Hanifa regarding when is the end of Dhuhr time and the beginning of Asr time. But the relied upon narration from Imam Abu Hanifa is the mithlain, when the shadow becomes two lengths. And Zawal al-Shams it's discussed. There's a number of ways of the zawal al-shams, but basically the shadow as the sun gets to the middle of the sky gets shorter and shorter, right? It gets shorter and shorter. And right, and when it reaches hadd al-istiwa, then there'll be a residual shadow. Right? There'll be a residual shadow. So it looks as if the residual shadow stops. Right? And then when the sun has gone past the zenith, the shadow now grows, but from the other direction. The mistake people make in trying to measure it, they put something on the ground, but one, they don't keep it straight. Number two, if you try to measure it with a pen, the residual shadow will be barely visible, and it'll take a long time for it to lengthen. So use something tall enough, right? And there's training on how to tell the times through different phenomenon, right? Okay, so there's two narrations from the Imam, because the principle according to Imam Abu Hanifa is that the governing text regarding this is the words of our Lord Mighty and Majestic, إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا أي مقدرا. Something has been defined, has been prescribed. كانت على المؤمنين is obligatory upon the believers. كتابا, delineated. موقوتا, right, in duly apportioned time, right. فالصلاة لا تجب قبله لا تصح قبله ولا تجوز بعده, right. أي يأثم بتأخيرها بعد الوقت. So the prayer is not valid before this time, and by delaying it beyond the time you are sinful, because it is كتابا موقوتا, right? That is what they have to do. That's the governing text. So from that, Imam Abu Hanifa established the principle that الصلاة لا تدخل إلا بيقين, وقت الصلاة لا يدخل إلا بيقين ولا يخرج إلا بيقين. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us it's كتابا موقوتا, it is delineated in duly apportioned times. And then, yes, a lot of the texts would indicate the earlier Asr time, but there are some texts that would indicate the later Asr time. Amongst them, Hadith Imam al-Jibril, which mentions that Sayyidina Jibril alayhi salam led the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam when the dhil, when the shadow was one length. So the Jumhur made ta'wil of it. They said, we understand it to be أي إذا قارب الظل, he was showing the end of the time. So it became one shadow length, meaning it became close to one shadow length. I said, yeah, it's muhtamil. They said, no, كتابا موقوتا. هذا أورث الشك في خروج وقت الظهر. فالوقت لا يدخل إلا بيقين ولا يخرج إلا بيقين. Time does not enter except with certitude, doesn't exit except with certitude. That's number one. Number two is from the meaning of Asr itself. Right? Because Asr, right, is the remains of something. Right? Is the remains of something. Right? Lexically. Right? And if you look at the word Asr is amazing, like what it indicates. Right? So it indicates the last part of the day. Right? And several hadiths as well relating to the Prophet ﷺ, telling them about you know, how long Asr lasts till one gets to such and such place. The place was relatively distant, so it would. So from that, there's sufficient doubt for Imam Muhammad that no, until we are certain that Asr time is in, which is the two shadow lengths, he took that position. Now, practically, and then there's been extensive discussion within the madhab about which is the relied upon position. The summary is, and you can see of the Mutaakhirin, Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, and Ibn Amir Haj, and Ibrahim al-Halabi, also Sahib al-Bahr, Ibn Nujaym, all of them go into extensive discussion on this. And this is one of the fault lines of fatwa in the Hanafi school. متى يعدل عن قول الإمام? When does one leave the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa? Right? متى يعدل عن قول الإمام. Right? And the author of Al-Bahr al-Rahiq, of Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, Ibn Nujaym, in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq tells us, rahimahullah, that لا يعدل عن قول الإمام إلا لضعف دليل أو ضرورة أو تعامل بخلافه. Right? That broadly there are three reasons why the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa would be left. Because his madhab. Right? It's his madhab. And these are his principles. Right? And broadly, there are three reasons why the position of Imam Abu Hanifa could be left. The first is, إلا لا يعدل عن قول الإمام. One doesn't leave the position of Imam Abu Hanifa إلا لضعف دليل, except for weakness of opinion. وهذا إنما يكون للمجتهد في المذهب. Right? This is only for someone who's reached the level of ijtihad in the madhab. And it's almost a shocking thing in our times, right? Partly, it's a modernist thing that, well, it's my opinion, right? And, and this, of course, Arabic, of course, has now adopted foreign terminology. Wijhat nadar. You told someone 100 years ago, what is wijhat nadar? It's a straight translation of point of view, right? It's not even an Arabic term. You won't find it in a book 120 years ago, maybe even less than that. Everyone has their opinion, right? But so that's one. And this is deeply contested, right? There are different masalik when it comes to fatwa in the Hanafi madhab. Like, to what extent can someone give fatwa on the basis of strength of evidence, that the position of so and so is stronger in evidence? Right? Who has the right to state that? And then does it then represent the madhab? Right? Does it then represent the madhab? There are two things. Right? Someone chose the opinion based on strength of evidence, but would this then represent the madhab? That's one of the battlegrounds. And there's different masalik. There's different pathways within the madhab, right? And they exist. What are you going to do about it, right? Right? One, the other, some were much more willing. Some were, look, with all due respect, unless there's need, we're not going to leave the position of Abu Hanifa. Others were more expansive in that. But how expansive? And does that represent the madhab? And it comes up here with respect to what Imam Shibulali himself has to say. So that's إلا لضعف دليل. The second is إلا لضرورة, except when there's genuine need. And ضرورة, by they mean الحاجة المعتبرة, recognized need. The third is أو تعامل بخلافه, when the customary practice is contrary to that. You're in a land where, for example, you're a Hanafi in Syria or in Jordan or many Arab countries where they pray at the earlier time. What do? in those lands, the ulama said the fatwa is on the qawl of the sahibain. Right? Because the ta'amul, لأن حمل الناس على خلاف ما تعرفوه حرج. Because making people do act contrary to their custom is an imposition of hardship. And it has many other harms, confusion, etc. أو تعامل بخلافه. So, but then of course if you read the matan carefully first, then you read the sharh, you see that and you see this in other works of Imam Shurunbulali. Imam Shurunbulali, and he's described by the people who came after as faqihun nafs, right? That there is an ittijah in the Hanafi madhab represented by al-Kamal ibn al-Humam and followed particularly by Ibn Amir Hajj, less so, but somewhat by Allama Qasim, also manifest in the writings of Ibrahim al-Halabi. Sahib al-Bahr is wary of it in some ways, but other ways he embraces it, and everyone who came after, and part of it is the brilliance of Ibn al-Humam is undeniable. That's why they call him al-Muhaqqiq and al-Itlaq. Imam al-Shurunbulali is clearly influenced by it. At-Tumurtashi is clearly influenced by it. Others who came after are clearly influenced by it. And of course, it's existed before, right? It's existed before. Others were very critical of this. That no, you're leaving the position of Abu Hanifa on all these things. What are you up to? Right? So that's one of those things. But most of the mutaakhirin took these choices, which are perhaps more frequent than earlier, on the basis of strength of evidence made by the mutaakhirin, especially post al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. But it's certainly not just post al-Kamal ibn al-Humam on this issue. You'll see not only was it the opinion of al-Tahawi, who took the position of the Sahibain, but many throughout history, and there's an extensive but there was a period where generally the Hanafis were more focused on the details of fiqh and legal reasoning much more than looking at the evidentiary basis. Is that binding or not? That's a matter of, that's the khilaf exists. Right? The khilaf exists. Broadly, the later school has respected these choices of al-Kamal ibn al-Humam and those who came after, accepting some of them, not accepting some of them. So let's see what. So the summary is, on this issue, the hasil is that the mu'tamad fil madhab qawlul imam. The relied upon position of the madhab is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, that Asr time enters at the later time, when the shadow becomes 2 shadow lengths beyond the residual shadow at the time of the zawal. That's the relied upon position of the madhab. In those lands where the ta'amul of the people is contrary to that, one can take the earlier time. That's the hasil of the issue. So here, Imam Shurunbulali is making an argument. So he says, روايتان عن الإمام في رواية, in one narration, إلى قبيل أن يصير ظل كل شيء مثله, till just before the shadow of everything becomes 2 shadow lengths beyond the residual shadow. It says in a narration, that he's making a legal argument here. In a narration, right? Because this is the narration from Imam, right? And this is the narration of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan from Imam Abu Hanifa, and it's Zahir al-Riwayah. But he's trying to make it just a narration. There's a narration this way, there's a narration that way. But which is the main narration from Imam Abu Hanifa? So this is actually his qawl. This is his opinion. سوى فيء الزوال, except for the residual shadow, beyond the residual shadow at time of zawal. لتعارض الآثار, because the different evidences that have come about the time. And we mentioned the hadith of the hadith Jibreel. Now here in the Maraqi, right? If you read the matan, it says واختار الثاني الطحاوي. الطحاوي chose the other وهو قول الصاحبين. It's the position of the صاحبين. So he takes a position, right? Making it seem that what's he choosing? The second opinion, or certainly strongly inclining towards it, right? But in the commentary he says here وهو الصحيح, and this is the sound opinion, right? Yeah. And this is, as Tahtawi says, وَصَحَّحَهُ جُمْهُورُ أَهْلِ الْمَذْهَبِ. This was chosen by most of the people of the madhab. Right? 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 وَعَلَيْهِ جُلُّ الْمَشَايِخ. And this is the position, says Ash-Shurumbalali, that most of the mashayikh are upon. وَالْمُتُونَ. And this is what the mutun are upon. And وَوُضِعَتْ لِنَقْلِ الْمَذْهَبِ. And the mutun were there to transmit the madhab. Now here there's one point in Tahtawi that the ulama would not agree with. Right? We see where he says وَهُوَ الصَّحِيحِ. Imam al-Tahtawi, Alama al-Tahtawi rahimahullah ta'ala, says وَقَوْلُ الْإِمَامِ الطَّحَاوِي rahimahullah وَبِقَوْلِهِمَا نَأْخُذْ يَدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّهُ الْمَذْهَبِ. Al-Tahtawi says, and we take the position of the Sahibain. That this indicates that it's a madhab. No. Because when they use the plural here, we take it, this we can be either the representative we, that a scholar who's an authority in the madhab, in a subject, we say, he's speaking there with the collective authority. Right? That we, meaning يقول علماء, they're speaking on, we, the scholars of the Hanafi school, choose this position. So that's the representative we, right? This representative authority. The other naqul, right? It's the affirmation of personal authority. I affirm in my authority as someone qualified to make this choice, I say this, right? So here the dilala is not. So what Imam Tahtawi says, that this position indicates that it is the madhab. This was, that this indicates that it is the madhab. This was rejected. This Ibn Abidin dispels this in his Hashiyah. And it's also discussed extensively in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq. He has a beautiful discussion on this. And Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq's discussion is built upon what Sahib al-Bahr discussed on it and others. But the hasil is what we mentioned, right? وَالرِّوَايَةُ الثَّانِيَةُ. The second narration from Imam Abu Hanifa, and this is the riwayah of Hasan ibn Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i. And it's other than Zahir al-Riwayah. Right? The other narration from the Imam, right? وَالرِّوَايَةُ الثَّانِيَةُ إشارة إليها بقوله أو مثله, or one shadow length, مرة واحدة. سوى ظل الاستواء, beyond the residual shadow at when the sun is at its zenith. فإنه مستثنى على الروايتين, because that is excluded in both narrations. والفيء بالهمز بدون يعني بوزن الشيء, فيء like شيء, ما نسخ الشمس بالعشي. The fate, right, is what the sun leaves in the afternoon time, right? So وَالظِّلْ مَا نَسَخَتْهُ الشَّمْسِ بِالْغَدَاءِ is the trace of the shadow in the morning time. So you have dhil in the morning and then fate after. Right? Right, as كان لي ظل رسوم, as the poet said, فاستوت شمسي فزال. عشت بالمحبوب حقا بعدما كنت خيال. كان لي ظل رسوم. I had the shadow of my forms. That's before the istiwa. فاستوت شمسي, then my sun reached its zenith. فزال, so it disappeared. عشت بالمحبوب حقا, then I lived truly through my beloved after I was mere imagination. Anyways. واختار الثاني الإمام الطحاوي رحمه الله وهو قول الصاحبين. And the second opinion of the earlier Asr time was chosen by Imam al-Tahawi, Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, although of course the al-Faqih Abu Ja'far is al-Hundwani, and Imam al-Tahawi was a great, he's famous for his Aqidah statement, especially in later scholarship somewhat, but above all he was a great Faqih and Muhaddith, right? He used to be Shafi'i, and then and he was a nephew of Imam al-Muzani, the student of Imam al-Shafi'i, and al-Muzani was fed up with him, said, nothing will come of you. And especially because he kept telling him not to read the books of the Hanafis, because he said you'll get confused. But he was distracted, al-Muzani felt he was distracted, nothing. So al-Tahawi got fed up and he quit and actually became Hanafi, and he swore, it said, that nothing will come of you. And it said that al-Tahawi said that had he lived on, he would expiate for his vow. But that's, Allahu Alam if that's established. There are beautiful biographies of the great Imams of of Abu Yusuf, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, Zufar, Hassan ibn Ziyad, but also of al-Tahawi by Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, and these have recently edited and published together by the very capable researcher and academic Dr. Hamza al-Bakri, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala. And if you don't have these books, then get his edition. Hafidhahullah, he's one of the very capable researchers and academics and doing excellent service. May Allah protect and preserve him. Okay. But Imam al-Tahawi, and he has a famous mukhtasar in Hanafi fiqh, but he made many ikhtiyarat in it. And the ikhtiyarat of Imam al-Tahawi are not by default taken, because he had a lot of his own choices. So there's people, even though they may be lesser in the madhab, right? Imam al-Tahawi is considered to be, according to Shah Waliullah and Allama al-Laknawi and others, he's at the level of ijtihad within the madhab, right? So even though he's higher in the madhab, but he had some of his own interpretive principles. So that when he chooses an opinion, it's not by default representative of the madhab. It's his ikhtiyar. Now he's a mujtahid in the madhab, so he has the right to make that ijtihad, and it may well be followable. But not insofar as it's representative of the school, unless the scholars who came after accepted that as being representative of the schools. Right? That's sort of the hasil in these ikhtiyarat, in these choices of the various authoritative imams in the madhab. Whereas there are scholars who may be of a high rank in the madhab, but not at the same level, like Qadi Khan, for example, or Al-Bazzazi, or the author of the Fatawa al-Zahiriyya, etc. Very respected scholars. They're nowhere near the level of Imam al-Tahawi in terms of the tabaqah, but their duty within the school is defining what is the relied upon position within the schools. So that's why they said, لا يفتى بخلاف قاضي خان. One doesn't make fatwa contrary to Qadi Khan. Why? Because Qadi Khan sticks to the mu'tamad of the madhab. But of course, these are mubalagha. It's overstatement for the sake of making a point. Okay. وهو قول الصاحبين is the opinion of the two صاحبين أبي يوسف ومحمد لإمامة جبريل العصر فيه, because of the imamah of Jibreel, because Jibreel alayhi salam led the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Asr prayer in it. right? And this is a contested line of reasoning, right? And that's why, right, that Sayyidina Jibreel led prayer after the mithil, led Asr prayer after the mithil. That's disputed. That's the whole basis of the dispute, because the outward purport of the hadith indicates that he led Dhuhr once the shadow length reached, at one shadow length. He led Dhuhr at that time. So, which is why it was understood that he led it Qubayla, just before, with some minutes left before. So they said, so this is how they understood the hadith of Imamat, the Imam of Jibreel. That's why, how the Shafi'is and Malikis understood it. Well, it's certainly the Shafi'is. The Malikis, there's a different position on Waqt al-Asr, which you can see in its own place. But then he says, لكن قد علمت أن أكثر المشايخ على اشتراط بلوغ الظل مثله. But that most of the scholars make the condition of the two shadow lengths. والأخذ به أحوط. And taking the two shadow lengths opinion is more precautionary. لبراءة الذمة بيقين. In order to clear one's due, one's dhimma, with certitude. إذ تقديم الصلاة عن وقتها لا يصح. Because performing a prayer before its time is not valid. وتصح إذا خرج. And it's valid if it goes out, if the time goes out. إذا خرج وقتها. فكيف والوقت باق اتفاقا. So how about performing it when the time is by agreement in? Right? So here, and then let's read the second, and then he says, وفي رواية أسد, right? And who's Asad? Yeah, right. This is Asad ibn Amr, right? This is other, and this is also related by Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad from the Imam. You have to be careful because there's different Asads who are famous, right? Amongst them is the companion of Malik, Asad ibn Furat, who took also from Muhammad ibn Hassan, but this is, what meant is Asad ibn Amr. Anyways, this is a non-Zahir riwayah. إذا خرج وقت الظهر بسيرورة الظل مثله لا يدخل وقت العصر حتى يصير ظل كل شيء مثليه فبينهما وقت مهمل. There's an opinion that if Dhuhr time exits at one shadow length, Asr time doesn't enter until two shadow lengths. So between them is a time of non-obligation. One time goes out, but the other time does not come in yet. There's waqt muhmal, right? This is not an accepted narration, right? Even though some scholars, Al-Karhi is said to have chosen this, and it's mentioned that Shaykh al-Islam Khwarizada said that this is caution, right? And it would be caution if one is in a land where the fatwa is on the position of Abu Hanifa, right? The practice is on the position of Abu Hanifa. Then we tell people, but still finish your Dhuhr prayer before one shadow length, so you don't enter into the khilaf, right? But this wouldn't be precaution in a land where people pray on the earlier Asr time, because then people will be missing. We'll be missing Salat al-Jama'ah, right? فالاحتياط إني في حد ذاته. So caution in of itself. أن يصلي الظهر قبل أن يصير الظل مثله. So caution would be to pray Dhuhr before, before one shadow length, i.e. before the early Asr time. والعصر بعد مثله. And to pray Asr after two shadow lengths. ليكون مؤديا بالاتفاق. In order to pray in a manner that is valid with agreement. كذا في المبسوط. Such is mentioned in the Mabsut. However, the ulama mentioned that if, that العمل يكون حسب العادة، يعني العمل يكون حسب ما عليه العمل في في البلد الذي هو فيه. One would act in accordance with what is the practice of the land that one is in. So if the general practice is that, so logically, amongst the believers, there are three possibilities with respect to Asr time. One possibility is neglected, which is that there's no Asr time, right? Nobody says that, right? So there's three possibilities, right? If one is a land where you're Hanafi, in a land, let's say you're in, in some part of Pakistan where everybody, broadly, or most people are praying according to two shadow lengths. So what do? You do that publicly and you do that privately, right? If you're in a land where the practice is on one shadow length, and that's the general practice, then you practice that both publicly and privately. Okay, so someone slept in for Dhuhr and in that case, they slept in and went past one shadow length, they should make tawbah, pray their Dhuhr as qada, right? And stick to that. Otherwise, it leads to laxity in religious practice and I'll find some opinion that deems it valid. That's not good. The third case is when the practice is mukhtalaf fihi. One's a place where some people pray early, some people pray late, right? So there, it is best to have a standard of practice that one follows, right? One of the considerations is where one normally prays, the masjid, where one attends a jama'ah, what is done there, so one takes that as one standard. But then, if one finds oneself in a place where the practice is mukhtalaf fihi, where they're praying at the earlier time, then one would pray at the earlier time with them. Because you don't do mukhalafat al-jama'ah. And if they're praying at the later time, then عند الاختيار, one would wait and pray with them, so that one doesn't miss the jama'ah. The other case is, what if you're in a land where generally, and this exists, for example, in some places where generally they pray according to the later time, but what one happens to be at a masjid or a place where they pray at the earlier time. Right? There, muwafaqatul jama'ah is a very powerful i'tibar. Right? But then the ulama differ on it, right? Because of the issue of, like for example, in some places, like in the subcontinent, this is frequently done by some of our attitudinally divergent brethren, etc. But even then, muwafaqatul jama'ah is a consideration. Like these are sallu khalfa kulli birrin wa fajir. And someone having bid'ah or mukhalafat in matters of belief or practice does not mean that they are not udul and ahl istiqamah. That's from the fairness of ahl sunnah. That yes, those opinions are grave and we take them seriously, but they're only we hold them to be following them sincerely. And then amruhum ilallah. Right? So, and that's an important consideration, right? Because the issue of muwafaqatul jama'ah, and this is particularly important in our times, lintishar al-jahl wa dhuhur al-fasad wal-ikhtilaf, right? Because they are, in Damascus it used to be so beautiful. The Shafi'is, it was the habit in most of the major masajid, after Salatul Jumu'ah, they would perform Dhuhr out of caution in congregation. The common people would leave and say, you ask them, what are they doing? Wallah, but they just don't know. Says, what is it? There's learned people there. Lakin said, they didn't tell us we have to do it. So they'll go. There's others who said, well, they say, we're Hanafi, we don't do that. Because at least there's khilaf, should about that. But there's a thaqafa diniyya, there's a religious awareness. But where there isn't, and these things lead to people to division, distancing oneself from divisiveness amongst the Muslims is a very important consideration. Similarly, also a separate issue, but Shaykh yuzkar, that, for example, Hanafi women don't pray in a women's only congregation, right? And we'll come to see that Jama'atun Nisa in our madhab is makruh tahriman. And in the Maliki school, it's not even valid, because it wasn't from the habit of the female companions. Only individual instances that are mentioned, which is mahmula ala ta'lim, for teaching. But if a Hanafi woman is amongst people who are going to pray in congregation, does one stick out like a sore thumb? No. There, one intends muwafaqat al-jama'ah. Because are they, because the al-jama'ah la yuwafaq alayha fil ithmi wal udwan, in sin and things that spread enmity or fitna. This is not a matter of fitna, this is a matter of ikhtilaf between a'immatud din. Right? So if they're doing that, then those things require soft-headedness or discretion. Right? Like I was told off by one of my teachers because I always preferred reading fiqh than doing a lot of extra ibadah. So at the Zawiyah, they're doing nafil in congregation. So I'd sit at the back and I'd just read a book or just make dhikr. So one of my mentors, he said, listen, you're going to sit here and pray with everybody. If you don't want to pray with everybody, go somewhere else. Right? And then come back after a little while. Go take a walk. Right? Because it causes tashwish. So how come that guy is not praying? Right? Especially if you're teaching this and that. Right? And if not, you can go away. But to sit where everybody else is praying in congregation and not doing it, especially where it would confuse. Some places people really don't care. So that and the safety there is to consult. So that is Asr time. Right? وَيَمْتَدُّ وَقْتُ الْعَصْرِ. Sorry. So where do we have? And then he says, وَأَوَّلُ وَقْتِ الْعَصْرِ مِنْ ابْتِدَاءِ الزِّيَادَةِ عَلَى الْمِثْلِ أَوْ الْمِثْلَيْنِ. The beginning of Asr time is when there is an increase in the shadow from one shadow length or two shadow lengths, لِمَا قَدَّمْنَاهُ مِنَ الْخِلَافِ, in what we have mentioned before of difference of opinion, إِلَى غُرُوبِ الشَّمْسِ, till sunset. عَلَى الْمَشْهُورِ, according to the widespread opinion. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من أدرك ركعة من العصر, whoever catches one rak'ah of Asr قبل أن تغرب الشمس فقد أدرك العصر. Because whoever catches one rak'ah of Asr before the sun has set has caught Asr time, meaning has initiated Asr time within its time. Right? This is related in Bukhari. وقال الحسن بن زياد, and Hasan ibn Ziyad rahimahullah said, and in our works, if Al-Hasan is mentioned, it's Hasan ibn Ziyad al-Lu'lu'i. It's important to familiarize ourselves with these great scholars. Of course, the hadith scholars had critique of some of the early Hanafis, and a lot of it revolves around two things principally. One is that the Hanafi, the tariqat al-fuqaha, the way of the fuqaha in relating hadith was frequently they related hadith bil ma'na, right, rather than bil lafz. And the muhaddithin took that very seriously. So they accused them of all kinds of things about the hadith. But what they're relating, that هذا يفهم من قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. That's نقل المفهوم. If you say قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, these are the words he said. This is what you heard from so and so. They heard from so and so. But the fuqaha would often take one hadith from here, يفهم من هذا كذا, فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, يفهم هذا من كلامي. Now this tension is healthy, because if the muhaddithin weren't there giving us a hard time, then the fuqaha would take their understanding, so that's a healthy tension ultimately. That's one aspect. Number two is there's ikhtilaf in whose narration you can accept or not. Whose narration you can accept or not. And sometimes people were criticized from whom they narrated from. And that led, and there's ikhtilaf on which rawi is accepted and which isn't. And the muhaddithin, but most of the attack of the muhaddithin really coalesced later. Right? So there's people they didn't accept, but the Hanafis, like people like Hassan ibn Ziyad or others, accepted their narrations. The third is that there is just a degree of hostility towards the Hanafis. And that's true, even towards Imam Abu Hanifa himself. So some of the critique, even the muhaddithin who came there, some of it is not accepted. Some of the critique is not accepted. But don't be superficial about it, because someone says, so and so. In the books of hadith, qila, that they're mudallis, they're this, all these attack words are thrown at them. Oh my God, the great students of Abu Hanifa were like this one Kafir said, they were whack in hadith. I said, no, they're not whack in anything. These are great imams, and they're mentioned amongst the great muhaddithin. The critique was due to certain things, and there's ikhtilaf. There's an excellent book. Of course, one is every talib al-ilm, right, should read. There's certain scholars of the 20th century, and some of them have lived on into the 21st century, bifadlillahi ta'ala, whose works one should take, that these are people whose works I need to read, and to prioritize reading. Amongst them in the 20th century, you have people like Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, you have Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Buti, particularly in the his works on Aqidah and method. But Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, his works, especially for students of knowledge, his Adab al-Ikhtilaf, his works on the Adab of Ilm, Qimatu Zaman عند العلماء, the value of time according to the ulama. Safahat min Sabr al-Ulama, pages from the patience of the scholars. Al-Ulama al-Uzzab, the single scholars. الذين آثروا العلم على الزواج. And these are great works, and they introduce you to so much Islamic scholarship as well. And they're easy reading compared to the terse ilmi works, right? But they enrich one. And particularly those works, but many others as well. Pretty much anything that Shaykh Abdul Fattah moved his pen to write is worthy of reading. It just depends on what you prioritize, but those are a good starting point. And then the lifetime associate of Shaykh Abdul Fattah and his closest student, and arguably the inheritor of his knowledge of the science of hadith, and Barakat Hada Zaman, Shaykh Muhammad Awama, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, the author of many, many great books. And of course, in the science of hadith, he has many important, significant books, but two that relate directly to talib al-ilm and for the understanding of the talib al-ilm. One is Adab al-Ikhtilaf, is the adab of, and there's few books that highlight the reality of adab and how we understand ikhtilaf. And it is a treasure chest of fawaid. And for example, he mentions Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi's 12 lessons that are understood from the adab of seeking knowledge, from the request of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to Al-Khidr alayhi salam, when he said, هَلَ اتَّبِعُكَ عَلَىٰ أَن تُعَلِّمَنِي مِمَّا عُلِّمْتَ رُشْدًا. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi says, just from the wording of the ayah, you can derive 12 lessons. Right? And he has this amazing muqtatafat. And also it gives us a lot of background insight that how did we reach this disastrous, divisive state in our religious scholarship and understanding in our times. That's Adab al-Ikhtilaf. The other work is Athar al-Hadith al-Sharif fi Ikhtilaf al-A'immat al-Fuqaha. Is the Athar al-Hadith al-Sharif is the effect of hadith in the difference of opinion of the fuqaha. And that, I thought he was exaggerating, but Shaykh Talal al-Ahdab mentioned that in 97, just before I was leaving to Damascus, that he'd read it 26 times cover to cover. I thought he was exaggerating. But that's a brilliant, brilliant work. ideally studied upon having studied the basics of ilm al-hadith, but it's, and that's actually translated into English now for some interesting reason, but it can be read even before the study of the science of hadith to appreciate why the science of hadith is important. And then for those who are more immersed in the study of the subject, there's a work by Dr. Yusuf Naif al-Biqa'i, Dr. Yusuf al-Biqa'i, the student of Shaykh Nuruddin Itr and others, on أثر الحديث أثر الاختلاف في علم الحديث في اختلاف الفقهاء. So he took the principles laid out by Shaykh Muhammad Awan, clearly influenced by it, but he goes systematically through every chapter of the science of hadith and how the ikhtilaf of the fuqaha in the science of hadith on everything, the definition of the sahih hadith, definition of what was the barrier between the sahih hadith and the da'if hadith, and each of the conditions, there are some nuances and difference between on every single condition of the acceptability of a hadith or its transmission or its narrators, or what is considered a blemish or a defect in the hadith or not. And then in the details of hadith, there's difference, right? And then of course there's specialized works in Hanafi hadith methodology. So this is a whole science, but it's important to be aware of some of it. So then he says, we'll just finish this off inshallah. It says وأول وقت المغرب وقال الحسن بن زياد إذا اصفرت الشمس خرج وقت العصر. Muhammad ibn Ziyad said that if the sun becomes yellows, so it reaches the waqt al-karaha, then Asr time has gone out. And these kinds of nuqul, one has to be careful that, is this what he meant? Or kharaja waqtul jawaz, is the time of permissibility gone? Right? So, وَحُمِلَ عَلَى وَقْتِ الْإِخْتِيَارِ, and this was interpreted, the words of Muhammad ibn Ziyad, al-Hasan ibn Ziyad, is the time of choice, meaning the time of praying without dislike, without sinful dislike. وَأَوَّلُ وَقْتِ الْمَغْرِبِ مِنْهُ, the beginning of the time of Maghrib is from it, غروب الشمس, sunset, إلى قبيل غروب الشفق الأحمر على المفتى به, is to just before the redness of the sky disappears, according to the fatwa position. Right? And this is disputed. This is disputed. The exiting of Maghrib time and the entering of Isha time, there are two opinions. The Imam Abu Hanifa took the same principle. Time does not لا يدخل إلا بيقين ولا يخرج إلا بيقين. Now, when does night set in? The Arabs differed. Because night, is it when the light disappears in the sky? That's night. And that is الشفق الأحمر. Right? The redness of the sky disappears. Right? Right? Because the redness of the sky is the direct traces of the light of the sun. In Jihat al-Ghurub, if you see the direction where the sun sets, you'll see redness there on the sky lasts longer there than on the other side. When that goes, it's night. But in the usage of the Arabs, night also happens when it's dark. Right? When the whiteness of the sky disappears, which is later. So now it's muhtamil. So instantly, Imam Abu Hanifa would say, لا يدخل لا يدخل إلا بيقين ولا يخرج إلا بيقين. So this is مختلف فيه. Then interestingly, the Sahaba differed on it. As you can see in the, and some discussion on this at length in Tahtawi. So again, what is the fatwa position? This would depend on, so here, the strength of evidence, there is not taslim that the Sahibain's strength of evidence would be sufficient to leave the position of the Imam, because according to his principles, right, related to, in general, to, that limits are established bil yaqeen, bil qat'iyat. The limits are established by decisive evidence, and there being khila, and time that decisiveness has been reiterated about that, etc. So according to the principle of Imam, his position fits in his principles, and it's his madhab, right? But practically, the wajh of the Sahibain has a basis in the Arabic language, but because both usages exist, it's understood from the practice of some of the companions, and there's dispute, which is the majority understanding of the Sahaba, etc. Now, intrinsically, it doesn't matter what the other opinion said. So here, Al-Tahtawi quotes Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, who discussed it, and basically he chose the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. Interestingly, Shrumbulali came after and was not confused, did not agree. Right? Did not agree. Right? Even though Shrumbulali comes after Al-Kamal, you can read the discussion in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, which is again strong support of the position of the Imam. But Shrumbulali wasn't convinced. Shrumbulali's reasoning on this opinion can be seen more extensively in Imdad al-Fattah. Anyways, but Al-Amr fihi sa'a. Now, وَهُوَ رِوَايَةٌ عَنِ الْإِمَامِ, and this is a narration from the Imam. Right? That when the redness of the sky goes, وَعَلَيْهَا الْفَتْوَى, and this is ikhtilaf. Right? Is the fatwa based on it for the strength of evidence? This is not غير مسلم. عليها الفتوى للعمل, because that's what the practice of a particular land is, or in general, that's more possible. وَبِهَا قَالَا, and this is the position of the Sahibain, the two companions of Abu Hanifa. لِقَوْلِ ibn Umar الشَّفَقُ الْحُمْرَةِ, because Ibn Umar said الشَّفَقُ الْحُمْرَةِ, the shafaq, what's it called? The twilight is the redness. وَهُوَ مَرْوِيٌّ عَنْ أَكَابِرِ الصَّحَابَةِ, this is related from senior companions. But Tahtawi mentions from Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam that Abu Hanifa's opinion was taken by many of the great companions. If you look in the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, you see narrations in both ways from the Sahaba. Now the purpose of a madhab is that it gives you interpretive principle. Do we just accept fawda, that take whatever opinion makes sense? No, because the Sahaba themselves were people of principle. Their opinions, you can actually deduce a method of each of the companions. Some Sahaba were Hanafistic in their interpretive method, like Ibn Mas'ud, right? The Hanafi school could be called the Mas'udi madhab, right? It's very deeply influenced by Ibn Mas'ud. There's others like Ibn Umar, for example, who are Shafi'istic, and the Shafi'i school is very deeply influenced by a range of companions, right? Because of the transmission of the school. But it's not this transmission of opinions, but the interpretive method. Because the Sahaba were trained under the Prophet ﷺ, and this is from the diversity. Anyways, وَعَلَيْهِ إِطْبَاقُ أَهْلِ اللُّغَةِ. So Imam Shrumbulai is making a big argument that this is what the Imams of the language agree upon. No, both are considered shafaq. The humra is considered shafaq, and the abyad is considered shafaq. Imam al-Tahtawi rahimahullah does a good job in explaining both opinions. وَنُقِلَ رُجُوعُ الْإِمَامِ إِلَيْهِ. Now, نقل الرجوع, always be skeptical. It is related, نُقِلَ. Now this is a way of making an argument, that throw the kitchen sink too. Maybe they'll think it is proof, right? And this is one of the things that be wary when someone says, I have 77 proofs for this. Someone had a contemporary scholar from the Skabna who likes sort of making big statements, had 77 proofs for a particular matter. I told that to a friend of mine, the founder of Dar al-Fath, Shaykh Iyad. He said, read me the first 10. I said, see, there's no point. He said, I want to hear. When you're in the first 10, I said, khalas, I'm going to write a treatise that Abu Jahl was Muslim. I said, Ittaqillah. He said, no, because if these 10 constitute proof, then I could use the same principles to prove the shaitan is Muslim, right? Let alone Abu Jahl, right? So you have to be aware when someone brings lots of evidence, why are you doing it? Right? Because al-haq doesn't need so much proving, right? Sometimes there's a need for it, but just be wary. Nuqila, that's why, but he's trying to make his point that it is related that the Imam left his position, but غير مسلم, right? As, but you're trying to argue your case, right? Because if you believe it, you're going to try to argue the point. And now, this is fair. Why? Because you're not saying he returned. He says, nuqila, it's related. هكذا قالوا. Right? It's like the gazelle, right? أأنت أخو ليلى؟ كذا يقال. Right? Yeah. Anyways, we'll tell that off the record. And then so here, again, Isha time, the Mu'tamad in the Hanafi madhab is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. It's his madhab. There's extensive difference opinion. So the later Isha time, interestingly, of course, most people, like if you look at what the astronomers and so on, what they consider true nightfall, it's according to the definition of Abu Hanifa. Like it corresponds. That's how they view it. The redness of the sky is a little more subjective, actually. It needs a lot more observation. But the redness of the sky is a lot more merciful, especially in the summer, especially in northern latitudes. So if one's in a place where they pray Isha according to the earlier time, then we'd say the fatwa then would be on that opinion. But also, where there's difficulty, then fatwa should be given according to the opinion of the Sahibain, the earlier Isha time. And that's also discussed in the work of Dr. Asim Yusuf, shedding light on, what is it called? Shedding light on the dawn, right? And then we'll start with Isha and Witr, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and the remaining investigations, and we'll get next class to the recommended and disliked times, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.